Thank you. My name is Scott Humphries. There it is. I am going to talk to you a little bit about brands and games today. As an indie dev, I think there's probably the idea that you can match a game with a brand and that will help you get noticed or help you get acquisition. That's true, but there's also some things to keep in mind if you're going to make a game based on a brand. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I am, as Catalin said, the head of product development for Lorraine. Lorraine is a studio based in Bucharest and Los Angeles, and we created our first game as a studio earlier this year, and we released a game called Link Twin that you may be familiar with. Right now, we're also working on another product by the name of Rumble League that we'll be demoing here at Dev.Play. So highly recommend you guys check it out if you get a chance and give me some feedback. But before I sort of joined the ranks of indie developers, I had a pretty significant tenure at Jamdat and then EA Mobile. And then I also worked for Disney for about 4 years. So I do have a lot of experience in creating games based on brands. Almost exclusively on the mobile side. So all the experience I'm going to be talking about today are some of the bigger branded mobile games that I've worked on. These are some of the ones that I've worked on over my career. And the interesting thing about brands is you know, they can bring tremendous value. They can be super valuable from an acquisition standpoint. You know, that first part of Travis Boatman's you know, split 4 things that you need for a build. It's you know, a brand can really bring in the audience. Though, if you're not careful and you don't understand some of the pitfalls of a brand, they can bite, and and you have to be very careful. So, we're going to talk about a few terms, and I want to make sure you guys understand what those terms are. So, I'm going to reference brand equity a few times in this presentation. Brand equity is the theory that, you know, every brand starts as original IP. But over time, that original IP garners an audience, and the bigger that audience gets, the bigger the brand gets, and people talk about it. And there's you know, new goods made around it, like consumer goods or interactive goods, and eventually, what was original IP becomes a massive brand. So when you think about brand equity, you have to think that, you know, there were a lot of huge brands today that started as original IP, whether they are from movies, whether they're from television, or even, you know, some big brands start in books, and other media helps those brands become even more massive, like TV or film or consumer products or theme parks. So really, brands can come from anywhere. Any sort of entertainment media is what I'm going to be referring to here when we talk about brands. And games are no different. If you think about some of the biggest game brands that exist today, they all started as original IP back in the day. Now, what we're specifically going to be talking about here are games that are based on big brands. So, you know, these games have a storied past, right? So, you know, some people have created, and some teams have created some of the most brilliant games based on brands. And those creators have created really interesting experiences based on the stories and the characters and the narrative that is inherent in that brand. And usually the gameplay excels in these video games as well. However, you know, the other side of the coin is some people have created some pretty bad examples of branded games over time. And I think those games have become more notorious in regards to what not to do when you're making a branded game. Now, I'm going to talk about specifically some challenges in making free-to-play mobile games based on big brands. So the first game I'm going to talk about should be familiar to all you guys. I talked about this game last year at Dev.Play, and I talked about this game in relation to live operations and the challenges of the back end and how we had to solve that issue. But we're going to talk about the brand this year.
Where'd Insight go? Why are you doing this to me? Because if I tap you 10 times in this game, I get free donuts. Are you saying I'm not real? I'm just a character in a game, and there are free donuts? Mm-hmm. Let's do this, giant me!
Download The Simpsons Tapped Out for free and tap Homer 10 times in a row. In addition to in-game donuts, you'll receive a special bonus decoration.
This game is life-ruiningly fun.
So I think, this game came in what I would refer to in probably like the version 1.2 or 1.3 of free-to-play games. I think one of the first mobile free-to-play games that was huge as a brand with Smurfs. This one came after, and we spent a lot of time, working on making this game be a fantastic match for the brand. And when we talk about being a fantastic match for the brand, we created this virtual Springfield that you could navigate. You could collect the characters from the show. We worked closely with the writers, the artists. We had the music. We had the actors VO. Like, we just did a really good job of making this game feel authentic to The Simpsons. Now, my personal viewpoint is that this game is much more successful because it was a better connection to gameplay and the brand than if we had made a match 3 based on The Simpsons, for instance, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Or if we had created like a gameplay mechanic like Angry Birds, where you fling Homer across the battlefield, like that wouldn't have made a lot of sense. So what I'm going to refer to now is a term that I learned at Disney, but I've since used it to apply to a lot of the different good branded games that I've played, and it's a term that I refer to as player aspiration. So I think in the best situations when you have a branded game, you have that sort of Venn diagram overlap of brand and gameplay creating the biggest area of player aspiration. And player aspiration is this idea that, if you connect those two things well, gameplay and brand, players are going to want to play your game even before they even come into it. So I think it's important for anyone to think about player aspiration when they're creating a branded game. And I'll just give you a couple of other real-world examples of where player aspiration comes into play. So there's 2 Star Wars games released around the same time, Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, Star Wars Uprising, both fantastic Star Wars games. However, the player aspiration was very different in both of these titles. Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes had you acquiring Star Wars characters. Star Wars Uprising had you playing, a new character through an original story. And, I think from the downloads, you can probably tell that, people kind of want to collect Star Wars characters versus play an original story, which, at least on mobile. Another really good one is Pokemon. There have been a few Pokemon games on mobile. None have been as successful as Pokemon Go. Why is that? Well, I think the player aspiration matches what you think of when you think of that brand. Running around your real world collecting Pokemon is a player fantasy that fits the gameplay in a really awesome way versus playing a match 3 with Pokemon characters. So you can just see here from the pure downloads that, it's not just the brand that's going to make your product successful. You have to really have a fantastic match of gameplay for that brand. And, the other thing that I want to mention is that sometimes a big brand doesn't always mean that you're going to have a big audience. So I learned a lot working at Disney about brands because Disney, out of any entertainment company in the world, probably has the most across a very varying degree of customers, from kids to adults. One of the first games I worked on when I was at Disney was a game called My Muppet Show, and this was essentially a builder in the vein of My Singing Monsters. We built this with a team by the name of Big Blue Bubble, and it just felt like a fantastic fit. If you've ever played My Singing Monsters, it's a game about singing monsters, and the Muppets are kind of singing monsters. So we're like, wow, there's this movie that just came out that's pretty successful. People like the Muppets again. There's a new movie coming out in a year, Muppets 2. We've got over 30 years of brand equity built up on the Muppets that will bring people in. And on August 2013, we released this game.
Put it all together now. Yeah. Okay. Put it all together now. All right.
So you can see from the gameplay, it's sort of a character nurturing building game with music, and we thought we would create a pretty great, authentic experience with player aspiration. So, we released the game and we looked at the KPIs, the key performance indicators when the game first launched. And, for a casual game by Disney standards, the game was actually performing on target, if not a bit above target in regards to our key metrics. So we're like, let's start throwing some advertising money at it. Let's put some money into Facebook and do some marketing. So the interesting thing about when we did the marketing for this title is the developer's other title, My Singing Monsters, was also on the App Store. So we were able to basically compare the advertising we were doing on Facebook for the Muppets to the advertising we were doing on Facebook for My Singing Monsters. And the interesting thing that we found was that for Muppets, at the time, a $2.30 cost per install was a bit expensive, and we were trying to figure out why that was, and it became even more alarming when we compared it to the current metrics for the cost per install of My Singing Monsters, which was much cheaper after the game had been out for roughly 6 months and had an install base of over 6 million users. We really couldn't figure out why a game with a big IP that had just released was harder to market than an original IP that had been out for 6 months. And I think this is the first time when I realized that this term brand equity, didn't just apply to time, that there could actually be this alternate effect called brand debt, which is over time, a big brand could gain debt and basically narrow your audience considerably. And this was an interesting discovery for me because I think it was the first time in my life when I had thought of a brand as actually being more detrimental to a game than helpful to the game. And that was really the case here, where the Muppets was performing worse from an acquisition standpoint than an original IP that had the exact same gameplay. It's a very interesting discovery. So I think you need to think about, as you're looking at brands, the wrong brand can actually narrow your audience because, in the case of the Muppets, there were people that knew the Muppets because they'd been around for over 30 years, but just weren't into them. No matter what we did in the marketing, no matter how cool the game was, no matter how interesting we made it seem, or how authentic we made it seem, there was just a large group of people that just weren't interested in the Muppets. Where with My Singing Monsters, it was kind of original. People didn't have this preconceived notion of what that brand was or what this character was, and they were willing to check it out. So definitely be concerned with that. Now, there are some cases when a big brand can be very helpful. And, in the case of Frozen Freefall, which we created with a local studio from Yash by the name of Mobility, this product is one of the most successful branded games I've ever worked on. Now, one interesting thing about this brand, it's massive now, and it's hard for us to remember that at one point, Frozen, the brand, was original IP. So when we were creating this game at Disney, people were sort of nervous about, well, is this thing going to be successful? Disney Animation isn't as big as Pixar. At the time, they weren't. And, original IP is really hard. It could be successful. It could not be successful. We jumped on it, and when did this original IP become a huge brand? And I could show you exactly when that was because it affected our game massively. This is an App Annie charting image that shows you that we were in decline in regards to acquisition after the movie released in December. However, at the end of February of 2014, Apple featured the movie in its digital release sort of brick, and it had a massive brick there for 2 weeks where you could get the movie digitally, and we were actually included in that brick next to the movie. And you can just see here that how our product was affected by that, with no paid marketing, just going from 250 in downloads basically up to the top 20. So At this point, Frozen was a phenomenon, and the team and Disney has ridden that sort of wave for the next 3 years after that to this day. But live ops brought the success. The brand brought the audience, but we created a good game that made use of things like limited time events, that was able to show you, here we had declining service in regards to revenue in the grossing charts. But when we released our first event, which was 2 years after we released the game, we were able to basically sustain the service with those events. So a brand is going to get you the audience. It's not necessarily going to bring you financial success in the game unless you have a good team that knows how to do live operations, monetize, push against retention, that sort of stuff. And some games make their entire business around limited time events and new movies that release. And Contest of Champions is a really interesting example of a branded game that basically does a limited time event with new characters every time Marvel releases a new movie. It gives them featuring in the app stores. They're able to change the icon. They're able to bring in cool new characters that people want to hang out with because there's a movie in the market. So, with the right brand, that sort of live ops events model can be extremely successful. And this is, I think, to this day, one of Kabam's most successful products that they ever released. So, things to think about when you have a branded game. Does your audience play games? Does your audience overlap with the genre? And one other thing I learned when I was at Disney, that what's your audience age? And this is something to keep in mind because lots of people are creating games and free-to-play games specifically based on movies that you would traditionally think of as family entertainment or kids entertainment. And we're not even going to go into the sort of the risk with COPPA. Some of that has been brought up in previous presentations. But, one thing you do need to understand if you're attaching a game to a brand is who's that brand's audience and are there kids? Because we created a game called Big Hero 6 Bot Fight that I felt the design was pretty awesome. It was essentially Puzzle and Dragons meets Big Hero 6.
Join Hero and Baymax on a match 3 adventure. Collect hundreds of bots, evolve them to their highest form, team up with your favorite heroes, save San Francisco, and kick some butt.
And at the time we released this, Puzzle and Dragons was at the top of its game. We really wanted to create a game like that, so we worked with a world-class developer by the name of Gumi, who had created a game called Brave Frontier that was one of the highest-grossing games in Asia at the time. So we felt like we just had like a slam dunk here, a home run. When we had the movie in soft launch, which is the time period before you release into global launch, just to learn, about the brand and the key performance indicators, we saw an alarming statistic. Because this was a family movie, we were required to put an age gate into the game. So one of the benefits of that was we were able to actually pull the downloads by age. And we saw that 25% of our audience was under 13. And in fact, it was skewing very young. With a game like this, you sort of want to have that like 18 to 35 male demographic, which is what Puzzle and Dragons mostly had. So we were skewing below that. It wasn't that big of a concern because we figured we could work with this audience. We still had a significant amount of the audience that was sort of in the teens and in their young 20s to 30s. So we felt we could work with it. The interesting thing was when we released the game after the movie, that changed to 44% under 13. And when you have half of your audience under 13, it's going to affect retention when you have a genre that's supposed to be aimed at adults, right? And Puzzle and Dragons generally is a more complicated system. It's an RPG. You've got upgrading. You've got fusion. And that was a real problem for us with the majority of our audience in this game. But, not only retention is monetization. Kids are going to affect monetization in all genres. There's a reason why you don't see a lot of kids' games in the top grossing charts. It's because no one's really cracked the nut of how to do free-to-play with kids. There have been some pretty good examples of people that have gotten close, like Crossy Road, Minecraft with a paid product, but no one's really figured out how to monetize kids in free-to-play. So you have to be careful when you're looking at your brand to make sure that you avoid what I refer to as the uncasual valley, which is don't make a game that is super core for a casual audience. Otherwise, your users are going to fall into this crevice of low retention and low monetization.